down, we're in the, we're swimming in the pools of the relationships that we find ourselves in. Some of them are positive, some of them are difficult. But no matter where we are, our focus needs to be on the Lord. Our relationships need to be to the Lord. Our passion, our desire needs to be for obeying the Lord, even in the most difficult relationships we find ourselves in. So I found that to be very, very helpful. Remember, we're doing these things for the Lord. Ephesians, let me flip over to Ephesians chapter 5 real quickly, and we'll just look at that. Ephesians chapter 5. Because the way he starts this off in Ephesians, and you might recall, Ephesians, many scholars believe that Ephesians was a circular letter, which means it would kind of go through a whole area, and a church would have it for a little while. They'd read it, they'd study it, and then they'd send it to the next church. In fact, even in Colossians, he mentions, after you guys are done with this letter, send this over to the Laodiceans, and now you guys can do a little switcheroo on letters so that you have a fuller understanding of Paul's ministry and of Paul's understanding theologically. But Ephesians was apparently similar to that. It covers a lot of ground and probably covered a lot of churches as well. And I want you to notice something he's saying here in Ephesians chapter 5, let's back up to verse 18. And you know this passage well, I think. Do not be drunk with wine, for that is dissipation, but be filled with the Spirit. Okay. So the command of Ephesians chapter 5, verses 18 through 21 is be filled with the Spirit. That's a verb. That verb is explained subsequently in the next few verses using participles. The first one, verse 19, speaking. How do we show that we're filled with the Spirit, that the Spirit is having a powerful influence on us? Well, we're speaking to one another. By the way, notice again, he mentions psalms, hymns, and spiritual songs. Using those as vehicles of instruction, not just as vehicles of worship to God. So speaking in verse, and we'll cover this another time, in verse 19, speaking, verse 20, giving thanks, verse 21, be subject to one another in the fear of Christ. And then in verse 22, he says, wives, be subject to your husbands. Now, a lot of people get all bent out of shape about, oh, well, wives need to be subject to their husbands. But don't forget about verse 21. What does verse 21 teach? It teaches an overlay of mutual submission of all believers to all other believers. Okay? It teaches that all believers are supposed to be submissive to one another. Be subject to one another in the fear of Christ. Are you saying husbands need to submit to their wives? That's kind of what it sounds like. And I actually think what Paul is going to say to husbands goes beyond just submission to, but it goes to their affections as well, making sure that we'll get to husbands in just a minute. But so I don't see this as something where, okay, men get to hold women down and women have to submit to men. There needs to be, in all relationships, mutual submissions. A desire of putting someone else's preferences, desires ahead of your own. Yes, there has to be an order, and there is social order. But as he describes, for instance, masters in the relationship to their servants, he says you need to think about their preferences and treat them fairly. It's not just about domineering over them. There needs to be a sense of mutual submission. So I think we need to keep Ephesians 5:21 in mind about this idea that we are all commanded to submit to one another as we go through the next couple of verses in Colossians chapter 3, which are very similar to that passage in Ephesians 5. Colossians chapter 3, verse 18, women, be subject to your husbands as is fitting to the Lord. I might even... Yeah, we do have a little note about that under the spirituality practice in marriage. Again, the idea of mutual submission. And then in Colossians 3:18, he uses this word to be fitting. Most of it is fairly straightforward. Wives, submit to your husbands. But then he uses this idea of be as is fitting to the Lord. So what is interesting about this is that submission is not molded on the husband. Submission is to be based on your relationship to the Lord. Okay? I don't submit to the wife doesn't submit to the husband because he's a good leader. does not submit to him because he's a bad leader and he really needs someone to help him along. The submission is based on your relationship to the Lord. And again, that's another one of those many to the Lord passages. There is, and the word is enego, to be fitting, to be proper, and it kind of makes me think that as we have the little note here, there is a distinctively Christian submission. Can you submit to someone who is a terrible leader, a terrible boss, a terrible parent? Yes, you can. Because the Lord knows all, sees all, and he is a wonderful leader. Because it is him you're submitting to. There is a distinctively Christian submission that an unbeliever is just going to have a hard time appreciating or understanding. Well, why do you stay with that guy if he doesn't treat you the way you think he should treat you? Because I'm submitting to the Lord. I understand, and there are examples where for the safety, and I want to qualify this, I don't want to be just superficial about this. There are instances, and I know of some, and maybe you know of some, where there's abuse, verbal, sometimes physical, and there's a time to remove the wife from what could be very potentially dangerous situations. So I don't want you to hear me saying otherwise, that the woman just has to sit there and take it. I don't think that's what the idea of submission is. In fact, I don't think the idea of submission, anywhere you see it in some of these passages, has anything to do with passivity. You know what I mean when I say that? It's not just, I'm going to lay back and submit. Obedience isn't passivity. Submission isn't passivity. Do whatever you want to me, whatever, I'll take it because I'm submitting. We need to submit actively. I know in my relationship with the Lord, if I put it on cruise control, if I'm not striving to actively, consistently obey, I'm not going to obey. I'm going to float off into a default position of disobedience. It takes a lot of work to obey. It takes a lot of discipline to obey. It takes a lot of effort to submit to those who are over us. And then the husband kind of has a similar idea put on him, and I think there is a time when the husband submits his will to his wife. Again, in that mutual submission, but I can't help but wonder if that idea of loving the wife goes beyond just submission. And I'll try to prove that for you in just a minute. We're going to jump back to Ephesians in just a minute. But verse 19, husbands, love your wives, and do not be embittered against them. And you might say, well, duh, it's kind of axiomatic. It's you can kind of take it for granted that the husband is going to love their wives. That the husband, that initial honeymoon, courting, romance period is just going to be constant throughout their marriage. The reality that Paul is aware of is that the affection of husbands tends to wane. That desire to always help the wife and help what can I do for you, darling, and here's some flowers, and what would you like to do tonight, and all these things, that wanes, doesn't it? And Paul is saying to guys, you need to get your focus back on your wife. You need to get your focus back on loving her. That takes a lot of work sometimes. Paul indicates that sustaining love that reflects true Christian submission and virtue requires constant attention and sacrifice. I want you to jump back over to Ephesians with me, and I think this is the last time we'll jump to Ephesians, because I want to make sure we focus in here. Ephesians chapter 5, verse 25, because I think you and I need to know, what does Paul mean when he says, love your wife? He gets extremely specific about what that looks like in Ephesians chapter 5, verse 25. And he kind of hashes through this a little bit more in Ephesians chapter 5. The section for the husband is in verse 23 through, 26, and it goes on a little bit beyond that. In fact, he gets into a broader discussion about the relationship between Christ and the church. We're not going to get into that. But look what he says in verse 25. Husbands, love your wives as Christ loved the church and gave himself for her. What's kind of odd about that? as Christ loved, it means, does that mean he doesn't love the church anymore? The word is in aorist tense. We've talked about aorist, and I don't even know what aorist means. It means a point in the past tense. When Paul says, love your wife constantly as Christ loved the church, he's pointing back to a specific moment when Christ showed his love for the church more than at any other specific time that he possibly could. What is he pointing back to when he said loved the church? He's pointing back to the cross. In fact, that's made explicit in what he says next, as Christ loved the church and gave himself for her. Okay, so I'm going to synthesize this for us. Kind of streamline this conversation a little bit and just get down to brass tacks. When Paul says, husbands, love your wives, he's picturing Christ suffering on the cross, giving everything he had for the sake of the church, and sacrificing lovingly for the church to his very last breath. That kind of sacrifice, that kind of amazing sacrificial love is what Paul expects from husbands toward wives continually. That's a high bar. I kind of rather be the wife. I just submit and I'm here and I'll do my... That's a very high bar that Paul sets for husbands. To sustain that level of sacrifice, attention, and guys, after the honeymoon period wears off, we get other pursuits, the kids come, and there's all kinds of things we need to chase down. We need to get back to sustaining a sacrificial, amazing level of love for our wives. Turn off the TV. Focus on the girl. Okay, that in and of itself can be a bit of a sacrifice. What do you want to do this evening? I'll set aside what I want to do. What do you want to do? I owe Martha. Martha, how many chick flicks do I owe you? Like a bazillion? Maybe 2 bazillion? She watches all my funny sci-fi and action, movies. I owe her a lot of chick flicks. It's kind of imbalanced there. We need to be really thinking about how we can put our wives in first place. And you know what? How do we do that? What does that look like? Well, it looks like what he talks about in Colossians chapter 3, verse 12. Patience, kindness, gentleness, having a heart of compassion. And again, that's a very, very high bar. Back in Colossians chapter 3, verse, we'll finish up the husbands here before we move on. Colossians chapter 3, verse... Philippians. That's why it doesn't look familiar, because I'm in Philippians. Colossians chapter 3, verse 19. Husbands, love your wives. And then look at the little warning he has here. Do not be embittered against them. I think we have a little note there about the word embitter. The verb to embitter, pikrino, is used figuratively here, and it is used literally in Revelation 11 and 8:11, 10:9, 10:10. This is where this wormwood thing, whether it's a star, whether it's I don't know what it is cast into the sea, and the water. This is what's interesting. We're not talking about that iced tea is a little bit bitter. We're not talking about something like that. It is thrown into the water. It is so bitter it makes people sick, and it is even fatal. Okay, so when Paul uses this word pikrino, do not be embittered. He's saying something very strong. This kind of bitterness will suffocate you and kill your spiritual life if we are not putting her first, if we are not loving her sacrificially. The noun form, similar word rather, pikria, instead of pikrino is the verb pikria, is always used metaphorically of a character trait among Christians that absolutely should not exist. Do not let any bitter root rise up, spring up from among you, the author of Hebrews says. That is a high bar. And it does no